Hi everyone, so my name is Natalie Roberts. I'm the new Executive Director of MSF UK. Welcome to this roundtable, which is entitled, How can disclosing clinical trial costs increase access to medical products? It's a discussion to explore practical implementation of disclosing clinical trial costs, and why should this be done and how? It's really great to see all of you here. There's a lot of people joined, so thank you very much. Just to highlight to everybody that this roundtable is recorded and the recording will be available afterwards. Before I introduce and hand over to our moderator for the session, I want to just say a few words on behalf of MSF about why we're convening this roundtable. It's actually the second roundtable in this series. The first was held in May, and it focused on why and how political initiatives and legislation can mandate the disclosure of clinical trial costs, including via the WHO clinical trial resolution. The recording and the outcome report from that first roundtable is now available, and we will put the links in the chat. Today's session will focus more on the practicalities of disclosing clinical trial costs. We want to hear from those directly involved in clinical trials, the people who are exploring how to do this and why it's so important. The first roundtable already highlighted that exposing the true costs of clinical trials is a really important step towards accountability and towards increasing equity in the biomedical research and development system, ultimately aiming to support efforts to increase access to medical products for those who need them. MSF, my organization, is committed to maximizing our own transparency related to clinical trials. And we look forward to an announcement later from Dr. Bern Thomas Nyangwa, who's the MSF medical director, and he's also the chief investigator of the TB Practical clinical trial. He's going to discuss a bit the steps or make an announcement about the steps that we're taking in this regard. This roundtable comes at a time when political momentum and discussions around clinical trials, particularly in relation to the COVID pandemic, do present an opportunity to highlight the critical role of clinical trial cost transparency. So let's go straight on to hear more from the experts. I'm going to hand over to Rachel Cohen. She'll moderate this session. Rachel is the Regional Executive Director of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDi, in North America. DNDi does publish some of their own R&D costs and have much experience in this area, both on the policy and practical level. So it's really great to have Rachel here with us to steer us through this discussion. Thanks very much to Rachel and the whole panel, and over to you.
Thank you, Natalie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really honored to be moderating this important and timely discussion, and I'm truly humbled to be joined by such an outstanding and inspiring lineup of speakers. We have a lot today, so we are going to get to it rather quickly. Just a few housekeeping items. The format of this webinar will be short 7-minute presentations from each of our speakers. That should take us almost up to the hour, and then it'll be followed by a question and answer period. If you have a question or comment to contribute, please feel free to put it in the chat. And now just a couple additional words of introduction. As we've all witnessed or experienced ourselves in an incredibly acute way during these past 3 years, the hoarding of knowledge, of data, of intellectual property, and of life-saving health tools and technologies has resulted in gross inequities in access to COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and treatments, and literally millions of preventable deaths. But this is really just an acute example of a chronic set of shortcomings and failures within our current biomedical innovation system that many of us have known about for decades. Transparency across the innovation lifecycle is critical, from the earliest stages of scientific discovery through to late-stage clinical development, regulatory approval, and production and delivery to communities in need. And this isn't just a lofty principle or an end in itself. Transparency and open sharing of research, knowledge, and data can accelerate the research process and engender greater public trust. Transparency in manufacturing costs and cost of goods can help ensure pricing of health tools is as close as possible to cost of production plus a reasonable and sustainable margin. Transparency of contractual terms and conditions for both R&D funding and purchase agreements can influence how intellectual property is managed, what licensing terms are negotiated, and how end products are produced and priced. And then there's R&D cost transparency. Clinical trials, it is often said, are the most expensive part of the R&D process, and high prices of medicines are often justified by saying that such prices are necessary to help recoup investments in R&D. But the actual cost of R&D has historically been shrouded in secrecy. To clarify the terms of the debate, clinical trial cost transparency is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle, and without it, the policy discussions that were mentioned before about how to finance research and development, about how to ensure affordability of medicines and other health tools are muddled, and the real life consequences, as we know, are dire. So let's get to it. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Chris Morton. Chris Morton is a friend to many of us, founding director of the Columbia Law School's Science, Health, and Information Clinic, and importantly, editor for the NYU report when he was at New York University on clinical trial cost transparency at the National Institutes of Health. Chris, could you summarize for us the key findings and recommendations of the report that I just mentioned, and perhaps highlight the what data is needed chapter? I think this is an incredibly practical illustration of what can be done to begin greater transparency about clinical trial costs. And be helpful if you could also touch on the extent to which you think these recommendations are transferable to other institutions that fund or conduct clinical trials. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks so much, MSF and everyone for including me in this terrific event. So as Rachel said, I am Chris Morton. I'm a lawyer. I work right now at Columbia Law School, and I'll say that I kind of come from that perspective first and foremost, thinking about the legality as well as the practicality of sharing data on the costs of clinical trials. I'll mention just briefly, before I went to law school, I was a chemist. I was a researcher myself, and then still have a little bit of that sort of scientist perspective. So it was my pleasure to partner, my students and I, with MSF on this report back in 2019. I think we got started. The report is entitled Clinical Trial Cost Transparency at the National Institutes of Health, Law and Policy Recommendations. And I've dropped a link into the chat and encourage folks who want more of the details to take a look at the document itself. Rachel encouraged me to talk in more depth about the kind of specifics of data sharing that we recommended. But I'll say a word first to sort of how we came to write this report. And how we came to focus on the NIH. So I think this event and the previous MSF event sort of set the stakes and explained why clinical trial cost transparency is important for a whole range of reasons. We, working in the United States, focused on the NIH because the NIH is the single largest funder of clinical trials in the world, invests over $40 billion in biomedical research every year, and spends over $15 billion on clinical research, including at least $6 billion on trials conducted outside the NIH. The NIH holds a huge and mostly untapped reservoir of cost data, and we thought that unlocking that data could unlock a meaningful amount of data on the true costs of clinical trial research. So I'll jump then to the specific question that Rachel posed, which is what precise cost data do we recommend that NIH and other holders of cost data share? This is all broken out in the report, but the key cost items that we have proposed to for NIH to disclose are personnel costs, including salary and benefits. That's of the clinical staff, administrative staff, and other staff involved in the clinical trial process, the cost of materials and supplies, the cost of clinical procedures, the cost of site management, including monitoring costs and site retention costs, central laboratory costs, equipment costs, other direct costs, including publication costs and contractual costs, and finally, indirect costs. And again, all this is in the report in more detail. We picked on these, and I should say, we urge that this data be disclosed in aggregate, but also on a per patient and per trial site and per year basis. Why did we pick these data points? Well, first off, we talked with a lot of folks, including some of the folks you'll hear from today at DNDI, at MSF, and other advocacy, civil society, and research organizations. We concluded that these are data points that are useful to those who conduct clinical trials and research and advocacy about clinical trials. We think that sharing these data points will facilitate apples to apples comparisons of the costs of various trials in the public sector, private sector, and so on. We think that these data points are useful to policymakers and legislators as they consider different legal and policy initiatives. We think that these data points will help permit more precise measurement of the relative contributions of government and industry, for example, to the creation of particular drugs or vaccines or other technologies. We also think that these data points will be useful to identify waste and inefficiency in the clinical trial process. And also important, at least from an American perspective, we picked these data points because we believe that the NIH and its grantees, its partners, are already collecting most, if not all, of this data. So this data should be relatively straightforward then to collect and share. There's much more in the report that I'm glad to chat about, but I think I'll stop there with a sort of summary of the report and pivot to the other question that Rachel asked, which is how transferable the report and its recommendations are to other institutions that fund and conduct clinical trials. So I'll say, this report again comes from an American perspective, and I need to be kind of humble about its parochiality. I think there are certainly going to be practical differences across the world, but at the same time, I think there are a lot of commonalities, important commonalities as well. So I'll just briefly mention the legal analysis that we did, my students and I, other legal experts that we've worked with. One of the hard questions that we grappled with was whether trade secrecy law or other doctrines of law in the US, in other countries, and internationally should prevent the disclosure of this cost data. And the conclusion that we reached is no, that trade secrecy law and other legal doctrines should not prevent disclosure. And I think that's true in Europe, that's true under the TRIPS agreement, that's true globally. So I think that's an important kind of transferable lesson. And I think, at least as to the specific data points that we've identified and proposed sharing, my hope is that those are of interest not just to those of us working in the US on access to medicines and reform of our pharmaceutical innovation system, but globally as well. But I will just say I'm really eager to hear from the other panelists and attendees who are working around the world to hear more about their thoughts. Also say just really quickly, I'm so thrilled to hear that MSF is committing to share more of its own cost data. I think that's a terrific initiative and grateful for it. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Chris, and I'm sure we'll come back to some more concrete questions about your report and about the recommendations and how those can be applied to other institutions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Sir Rory Collins, who is Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology and the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health at Oxford University. He's the principal investigator of UK Biobank, was a critical player in the design and leadership of the recovery trial, and was also key to informing the design of the important WHO Solidarity trial early on in the COVID pandemic. Sir Rory Collins, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you to MSF for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to use some slides to just back up my comments. I think the MSF initiative to determine what the costs are is a very important one. But what I'd like to persuade you of is that it would be even more important to understand why the costs are so grotesquely high and why they're increasing, and most importantly, what can we do? And unless you know the history, I think it's very difficult to solve the problem. And in my view, the problem of the cost of clinical trials has been largely driven by a decision between industry and the three main regulators, the FDA, the EMA, and the Japanese regulator, to establish what was called the International Committee and then Council for Harmonization of Clinical Trials, ICH. And in April 1990, the regulators and industry got together because industry wanted to have a single set of regulations that would result in rapid regulatory approval in the major markets of the world. So these guidelines are about getting rapid approval. They're not based, by contrast to the claims in the document, on actually the scientific underpinnings, the principles that underlie clinical trials. And that has been a major problem since the ICH Good Clinical Practice Guidelines were launched in the mid-1990s. They were intended for the registration of new drugs, but there has been massive mission creep, so that they are now being applied to all randomized controlled trials, not just of new drugs, but of all drugs trials, and indeed of other trials, of other interventions. And this is being done by government funders, by charity funders like the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust. It has been enshrined in the EU regulation. And from that point, there has been a massive increase in the cost of studies. So there has been a very substantial adverse impact of this guidelines, which has then been adopted into regulations in the EU and elsewhere, resulting in increased obstacles, delays, and costs for trials. It's distorted the research agenda. It's really resulted in companies not collaborating with academia in the way it used to, but depending increasingly on contract research organizations. And indeed, if you look at that point in the mid-1990s, the contract research organization did not exist. It is now a $70 billion a year industry, and all of the incentives for the CROs, and indeed for academic research organizations, AROs that run clinical trials, is to add complexity, to add more and more layering on of activity, because that increases the profits of those organizations. But that's money being pulled out of the evaluation of all treatments. There is very good evidence that there are now fewer new treatments being developed by industry and fewer academic trials of current therapies being conducted due to the cost and complexity of this. And the EU published a report in 2009 that demonstrated that that was true as a consequence of their EU directive in 2001. Here is, I think, one of the most chilling sets of data I've seen in this context. So if you take the top 10 drugs by sales in the US, in between 2000 and 2015, there has been a 2.5-fold increase in the revenue associated with those drugs. But there has been, along with that, a 7.5-fold decrease in the population that are actually being treated with those drugs. What we're seeing is a shift away from drugs for common conditions like heart attack, stroke, diabetes, HIV in many populations, towards high-cost, very effective drugs for relatively niche conditions. It's not that those new drugs that have big effects in relatively small populations are not good, but what it's doing is it's driving the innovation away from the development of drugs for common conditions. The impact of this regulation has been towards a very risk-averse approach to clinical trials, with an undue focus on complying with rules rather than on innovation in the design and conduct of randomized trials. And that too has caused increasing problems. We've seen trials done in the middle of epidemics, trying to comply with good clinical practice guidelines that have been hampered enormously by the attempt to do so. And the European Society of Cardiology, I do cardiovascular clinical trials primarily, concluded in 2013 that the regulatory barriers to properly conduct clinical research in Europe currently abound. It can be mind-bogglingly difficult to do clinical trials. We addressed this in a paper in the New England Journal in February of 2020, just prior to the pandemic, and a month later, as we were developing the recovery trial protocol, which really adopted many of the principles that were espoused in this paper. and really made an argument that there is an urgent need not only to find out how much trials cost, but to work out how to ensure that they don't cost as much, and to look at ways in which to take advantage of technological advances in order to do trials much better, much more efficiently, and to do many more trials of many more treatments. So what did those guidelines say? We need to develop appropriate trial guidelines, as I said, based on scientific principles and in partnership between regulators, researchers, and patients, not just regulators and industry. We need to enhance recruitment strategies for recruiting patients more quickly into appropriate clinical trials and more generalizable populations. Improve clinical trial quality by using IT and electronic trial management systems and centralized monitoring, rather than having people visit sites, which is one of the most costly elements of many clinical trials. And more effective follow-up, again, through using health record systems and other technological advances, such as apps, directly to patients. At a meeting of the heads of international research organizations some years ago, I made this plea, and as a consequence, the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation funded the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative. My colleague, Martin Landre, has been leading that, as he did with the recovery trial, and we have developed, in collaboration, clinical trial guidelines, which I think the next step would be to get those endorsed by organizations such as MSF, and to get them adopted and replace the obstructive ICH GCP guidelines, so that we find out not only how much trials cost, but how to reduce the cost in order to get much more reliable evidence about safety and efficacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Collins. We'll come back because I think there are also some follow-up questions we'd love to direct to you. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Bern Thomas Nyangwa, a medical director of MSF and also the chief investigator of the TB Practical clinical trial. Bern, could you please give us a brief summary of the clinical trials that MSF is involved in, of course, including TB Practical, and MSF's work on clinical trial cost transparency, especially the recent announcement that we're all happy to see about MSF's commitment to increasing transparency across the board, but cost transparency in particular, and maybe also touch on some of the challenges that MSF faces in making these costs public, and how you might plan to overcome those. Please go ahead.
All right, thanks so much, Rachel. And thank you for the organizers and colleagues for coming together on this discussion. So I know that a number of people on the call might already know this, but I just want to take a few points to talk about MSF in general. So as most of you would know, MSF is an international medical humanitarian organization that is driven in line with universal medical ethics in decisions and the work that we do. We provide medical assistance to people affected by conflict, epidemics, disasters, or exclusion from healthcare in general. So just to give the scope of what we do again, in 2021, we provided outpatient care to over 12.5 million people, and we hospitalized over 1 million people in our projects around the world. So in MSF, although this is what we focus on, we try to not only focus on the populations in front of us, but also think about some of the larger questions globally, or even in the populations that we're assisting. Think about the future. What is it that we can do in that place for what will happen to future populations? And you might also know that witnessing and advocating are really integral to what MSF's humanitarian medical assistance is all about. So in short, just to say, so MSF really then considers research part of this advocating, part of this trying to see what we can contribute to, especially neglected population. And often we do research that is around quality improvement, such as operational research. But there comes a time when we realize that the need, the neglect, and the opportunity, including the added value that MSF has, really asks us to engage in clinical trials. So we've done different clinical trials. Rachel, we know that from, with DNDi, we've done a lot of clinical trials that are actually focused on neglected tropical diseases, as well as, visceral leishmaniasis and human African trypanosomiasis, all those kind of clinical trials. And I'll share that the other example is a TB practical trial, which is a randomized controlled trial looking at shorter treatment regimens for drug-resistant tuberculosis. We just shared the final data at the Union conference recently, and we expect that we'll share the full publication of the data soon. But this clinical trial is one of the bigger clinical trials that MSF has, not only involved in the implementation of it as investigators, but sponsoring it, designing it, really going through the whole process. I'll touch on that a bit later, but as also alluded to earlier, I'm really happy to announce that we as MSF are publicly sharing our MSF clinical trial transparency policy. And what is this policy really? This is a policy which covers a couple of things that I know are generally expected in clinical trials, such as prospective registration of the trials. We have also in that policy wanted to highlight the need for the publication or sharing of trial protocols as soon as ethics approval is obtained. We include timely publication of results in peer-reviewed open access journals or publicly accessible free servers. But also quite critical to that policy is the sharing of those results to communities and that have been involved in the trials and those that are affected. And quite relevant to this discussion this afternoon is also the need to publish clinical trial costs. Colleagues who have studied this area and also with other experiences have already highlighted why sharing clinical trial costs is important. We know that clinical trial costs inform policy development and evidence-based decision-making. It will promote innovation, especially those non-traditional actors who are not very sure what it would potentially cost. It will help in price negotiations because you'd have an idea when it comes to medications or drugs or other medical material that you want to buy. If you have an idea of what this generally would have costed to get there, it's quite helpful from that perspective. It also helps in accountability and maximizing the impact of public funding. Of course, all of that hopefully has an impact on access to medical products. So why is cost transparency important to MSF? Why are we putting it in our policy? I think we all know that MSF is not going to be counted as one of the organizations that does most of the clinical trial research or even a very small proportion of all clinical trials globally. But we do feel that as we asking and demanding and pushing for clinical trial transparency, cost transparency, we need to walk the talk. And I also have to say that it is not, we're not saying in any way that this is easy, but we're saying this is important. Therefore, we need to do it on ourselves, and we will continue to demand, to spotlight, discuss the need for transparency in clinical trial costs. We will, in the coming year, start from the sharing the cost of the TB practical trial. The trial, as I mentioned, we've shared the results. We expect to have the final close out of the trial in the coming months. And as soon as that is completed, in fact, in parallel to that, we've already started working on how we can actually be able to share the clinical trial costs from the TB practical trial. So we will continue to advocate, we will continue to demand transparency, and of course, working through the Access campaign, MSF Access campaign, and other advocating channels, we will continue this discussion and spotlight the need for clinical trial cost transparency. Thank you, Rachel, and I'm happy to engage in further conversations at the end of the other panelists' presentations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bern. It's my pleasure now to turn to Dr. Duduzile Ndwandwe, who is Deputy Director and Vaccinologist of Cochrane, South Africa, at one of the world's most important medical research institutions, the South African Medical Research Council, or SAMRC. Mm-hmm. She's also the lead clinical trial registry, the lead of the clinical trial registry portfolio at MRC, which includes the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry and the South African National Clinical Trials Registry. Dudu, could you share with us what information is currently collected about clinical trial costs, if any, in South Africa, and why this is important? And also some of the challenges you may have encountered in collecting this information and making it publicly available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be part of this esteemed panel. As you mentioned, I am the leader of the Clinical Trial Registry portfolio at Cochrane, South Africa, and we're managing two databases. One is a WHO primary register, and the other one is a national registry funded by the National Department of Health. But these ones are distinct. The two registries are distinct in a sense that the national registry, that's where we are collecting the national budget, the national cost of the trial that is conducted in South Africa. Whereas in the Pan-African Clinical Trial Registry, we just need the information of who is the funder and what are the details of the funder, but we don't really need the cost. And I just want to take a little bit a step back just to discuss some of the challenges that we see in terms of sharing the cost. When we see these trials that are coming on our registry, there seems to be hesitancy in even sharing with us because the cost of the trial in the national registry is not in the public domain yet, because that is seen as a private matter. And we've been engaging with stakeholders to see how we can share that information in the public domain, because indeed it has a benefit in understanding how access to trials and the decisions that are made thereof for these interventions in which the trials are conducted in the country has an impact in terms of the costing. But we are not there yet. I think it's a discussion that we need to get there. And you find that there is hesitancy even among the researchers to voluntarily share this data, knowing very well that it's not in the public domain, even with us as registry administrators. I suppose then the question is, why is that? Why is it that budget becomes an issue that needs to be private? And I think if we can understand and unpack that a little bit, I think we can go far in terms of understanding transparency on a broader scope. It's not just about data, but it's also about the costing and the initial agreements that the PIs and the funders have at the beginning of the trial, because there are cost implications that come in. And as a result, we get to have a better sense when these drugs are being rolled out in the country. We can then compare why is the prices are escalated and why is it that the prices are different when we need to roll out and have those interventions in the public domain. So it has been a challenge on our side. But what we have done in the National Registry is that we have made it mandatory that we do not register the trial in South Africa without the national budget at least. But we don't even go to a step further of saying what is the cost of the actual drug, what is the cost of staffing, and break down all the costs. We just want the total budget. Is it true? The answer is we don't know. And it requires a lot of collaborations with ethics, SAPRA and other entities to come together and actually discuss this issue of the budget, because I think that is an important topic when we are looking at the trials that are conducted in the country, and these trials would eventually prove to be effective and have interventions that will help the population. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dudu. I know we'll have several follow-up questions to you, I'm sure, during the Q&A, but thank you so much for those insights. And now I am delighted to turn to our final speaker, the inimitable Fatima Hassan. Fatima is a human rights lawyer, social justice activist, founder of the South African-based Health Justice Initiative, and also recipient of the 2022 Calgary Peace Prize. Fatima, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've heard today and how you would respond to the points that have been made by our previous speakers, but in particular, how clinical trial costs could be made publicly available, and what impact this could have in South Africa and beyond, including potentially, if you can, the impact this could have for new initiatives such as the mRNA hubs?
Nice. Thank you. And it's just such an honor to be on this panel and have Rachel moderate this conversation. And I'm so glad that I'm on the same page as Professor Dr. Dudu Zile from the MRC. So I just want to make about 7 points. The first is that, unfortunately, this pandemic has shown that we are in the middle of a major secrecy crisis. There's so much secrecy, not just in South Africa, but around the world, that as a whole, nobody really knows what the total trial costs are in South Africa, elsewhere, for COVID, for any other disease. And to try and collate that information is going to be a Herculean task, mainly also because there is no legislative mandate or requirement on trial sponsors to actually disclose the full disaggregated costs and the costing data. And we'll come to the political reasons for why that kind of strategy around proactive disclosure and increased transparency will obviously be so resisted by pharmaceutical companies and by industry players that are not totally committed to the idea of total trial cost transparency. So we may be able to, at some points, to access a trial protocol or a trial amendment, but try looking or searching for any of the costs related to the funding of these trials and for trial participation, it's difficult. In South Africa, we've had a situation where our researchers have been looking for this data, and we've been told by different units that this is a function of somebody else. So the presidency will send you to the Department of Health, will send you to the Department of Science and Technology, will send you to the Medical Research Council. So, you know, one of the critical things the WHO is going to have to engage on is the different functionaries in each different country, and how we're going to actually ensure that there's alignment and that there's accuracy in the information that's provided. And this is important because what's currently happening in Africa in particular, or, you know, obviously a lot of this is happening in South Africa, it happened during COVID, is that trials are being run both through public mechanisms or vehicles, and I'll come to that just now, as well as through private sponsors and private partners. And they're privately run trials of which there's very little information. It's even more difficult to access the input costs into those clinical trials. And then when trials are being run by public institutions, it implicates public universities, which the South African public is actually highly subsidizing. It includes public scientists whose salaries are actually paid through mostly the public purse or through those universities or through student fees, very seldom through a supplementary contribution from a trial sponsor, and then the public in both public-run trials as well as privately run trials, communities of people who are at risk of HIV or TB or cancer or of COVID are actually participating in the trial. So being able to quantify and accurately estimate what the true costs are of a clinical trial, I think is obviously a very difficult task, and it includes some of the more direct input costs and obviously includes some of the more indirect input costs. And what we found in South Africa is that it's often a he who puts the money into a clinical trial often calls the shots in relation to access, in relation to pricing, in relation to the timing of submission of clinical dossiers to the medicine regulators, and also in relation to the timing of when generics could possibly come into the market, the transfer of technology, the issuing of voluntary licenses. So costs of clinical trials is one of the key kind of overarching factors that influences the industry's narrative around research and development. So let's talk about the big ugly words R&D. R&D is often, for the last 20, 30 years, has been used as the reason and the sole justification for why the industry needs often 20-year monopolies, often longer monopolies on a particular product. And whether that could be a blockbuster product, for cancer, for HIV, for vaccines, as we saw with the overnight billionaires of some of the front-runner mRNA companies. So the costing of a clinical trial and the R&D cost, which is unknown, which is often secret, which is often difficult to kind of collate or coordinate or try and get a universal registry that actually tells you what a certain clinical trial actually costed, and how much of that was actually funded through pure public sources and how much of that was funded through the trial sponsor. It could be the NIH, it could be a drug company. And so what we're interested in when we worried about post-trial benefit sharing and access and pricing and intellectual property claims is who actually put the money on the table and who actually participated in the trial. So R&D then is used as sort of, the main reason and the justification and the rationale for extended IP monopolies. And we see that with evergreening of particular blockbuster products as well. And IMEC and Public Citizen and others have done a lot of work on that. But that R&D narrative is a really sinister one, right? Because yes, there is a considerable investment in clinical trials in the R&D aspect, but until you actually can disaggregate who actually put what onto the table, without having the transparency of that disclosure and the full data costs, and no company will ever want to disclose that. We've tried in many instances. They would rather issue voluntary licenses than disclose their true R&D costs. So it's used as the argument to justify IP, but it's never, the evidence is never provided to show, well, this is actually what it truly costs us. And here we're talking about what the true costs are, not what the costs that the industry claims that it actually put down on the table. But that R&D argument is then used to also determine the rate of profit and the return on the so-called investment made by particular drug companies. And I mean, we all know the argument about how a blockbuster product is then often used to cross-subsidize something that may not come to the market quickly enough and to try and cover some of the other costs of other products. And I think that's something that as a movement of people working on access to medicine, we're also going to have to discuss. But what the R&D data would also show us, aside from the IP claims, aside from the pricing and that determines access and equity and profit margin, is it would give us a really good barometer into how much money is actually being put on the table by our own governments, as well as the industry, into what we call neglected diseases, or diseases that affect the majority of the people in what we call the global south. And that language is subject to change over time. So the hesitancy to share information that Tuduzilia speaks about I think has played out really in this COVID pandemic, where multiple groups around the world have had to use what we call access to information laws to get basic information about who funded the trials, how much money was actually put on the table, from which source. And that is how, for example, Kai and Public Citizen were able to, do back of the envelope sums to basically expose that a lot of the funding for the clinical trials and some of the accelerated vaccine research, particularly under Operation Warp Speed, actually came from the US government. Or in the case of Europe, some of that funding was actually underwritten. The risk was actually underwritten by governments in the EU, which meant that the public was actually investing in R&D. And in addition to that, what we're also finding, and some of the speakers have already mentioned the Gates Foundation, but in addition to public and private sponsors, what we're now seeing is a new trend of philanthrocapitalists actually supporting the cost of clinical trials and investing money in without many of us understanding what the terms of that funding is, what the conditions attached to that are, and what that then means for the idea of post-trial benefit sharing and the idea of, if you use public facilities and public universities and public scientists and you rely on historical public knowledge, for example, work done on Ebola or HIV, how does then that become cemented in the idea of a public good? And who is actually sitting around the table making those decisions that influence whether the knowledge that is generated then from a clinical trial at the end of it is then privatized or is actually shared in the interest of the general public. So it's this idea of commodification, which is inherent in IP law, and this idea that you give a monopoly on life-saving access to medicines then seeps into this narrative of R&D, and it seeps into the way in which a clinical trial, once it ends, it's actually then able to either provide benefit for the community or not provide benefit for the community. And we've seen that with Tabla, we've seen that in the last 20 years as well around the conclusion of trials for HIV/AIDS. So I just want to end by saying that obviously the transparency is critical, but it's critical for a number of reasons, mainly for us because it actually there's a direct correlation to equity. It heavily influences equity. It influences the timing of access for many of us in the global south, and then it also influences whether you have an affordable price or not. So who funds what trial and for what purpose, I think actually needs some kind of, not just a WHO clinical trial resolution, we're actually now in the phase of where we need legal intervention and we need laws to be passed to make it a legislative requirement for that information to be made public, because we cannot spend the next 15 or 20 years filing access to information requests to try and get such basic data. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Fatima. We're done with our first kind of portion of the session, and I really want to encourage participants to put questions, if you have them, even clarification questions in the chat. We've seen a few coming through already, and we will get to them. Just to kick off the discussion, though, I want to ask a couple of questions, and I'm actually going to start with you, Fatima, because where you ended is sort of exactly where this conversation needs to go. Do you see opportunities in the coming months or next year, either at the national level, at the regional level, or perhaps at the global level, to kind of codify, okay, codify might be a strong word, but where are the policy opportunities to actually start shifting the norms around these topics? So around cost transparency, of course, but the broader set of issues that you raised that will lead to a greater public understanding of the R&D process and greater assurances that at the end of the day, that process will be geared toward equitable access to the fruits of scientific progress. We know we've heard about the negotiations happening at the WHO for a potential pandemic treaty. There are many discussions I know happening regionally and nationally. Where do you think some of the important policy opportunities for real systemic change are?
Thanks. And I mean, I think some of the other panelists have been following the WHO trial resolution process, more closely, and they can come in on that. But I think that is a key opportunity. However, I think that, all of us are alive to the fact that the industry is obviously going to oppose that and not want that to become part of the resolution. If you look at how industry responded to the TRIPS waiver negotiations, I think none of us are naive to think that, if this is something we propose, it's actually going to be included, because there's a lot of vested interest not to have disclosure, right? And not to have transparency. So I think there is one opportunity, but I think to supplement that, what we have to do in every domestic context is now start demanding that our lawmakers actually make this a legal requirement. So for example, South African lawmakers could pass a legislative amendment which says that anybody who wants to do a clinical trial in South Africa, whether it's a public trial or a private trial, will have to disclose all of their direct and indirect costs, all of their sponsors, all of the terms and conditions. So we can get a better understanding of, what is actually in the pot, right? And so you're able to hold different decision makers to account. But that basic transparency, is not mandated by law. And I really think that we can have as many resolutions as we want and as many voluntary kind of, asks as we want, but the industry will not play ball with the request or an invitation to share data. It actually has to be a legal requirement. So I'm less optimistic that these global processes will actually result in that kind of change. And I actually think that you now need the holistic approach. We could, as civil society, use access to information laws, take this to higher courts, take this, in South Africa to a constitutional court and try and get mandatory disclosure. But we can't even get access to the vaccine contracts. That's being withheld. Everything is, subject to a non-disclosure agreement and high levels of secrecy. So, yeah, very little hope there too.
Maybe let's turn to another domestic context, because I think your point that this will ultimately have to be legislated at the national level is an interesting one. So, Chris, as we know, the report that you produced here in the US actually has been on a legislative journey of some sort. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the NIH and how lawmakers here in the US have responded to the recommendations for reform that were outlined in the report? Have they raised implementation challenges? And can you talk a little bit about how those might be overcome?
Sure, yeah. So I will say, first off, I have not been the sort of main driver of advocacy work within the US, either at the agency or administrative executive level, directed at NIH and the Department of Health and Human Services and the White House, or at the legislative level, directed to Congress. That work has really been led by MSF and by a broader coalition of groups in the United States that includes Public Citizen, and I think DNDI is a member. So just to say, I don't want to take credit for any of this. The short summary is, I'm trying to think how much of this how much of this dirty laundry I should air publicly. I think it's fair to say that we had a number of conversations with policymakers within the executive in the United States. We talked to folks at NIH, at HHS, and at the White House. And there was some sympathy or appreciation for the notion in principle that cost transparency vis-a-vis clinical trials would be a good thing, but also a hesitance to make this a priority. The administration, HHS, NIH sort of had practical concerns, et cetera. And the short answer is we didn't get a ton of traction. So I think it's fair to say a lot of the advocacy efforts pivoted then to Congress, to legislation that would mandate that the US government and NIH specifically share the data that we had advocated. And we found better traction there. So early this year, a number of senators and representatives in the United States introduced new legislation called the Pharmaceutical Research Transparency Act, or PRTA, that would mandate disclosure of disaggregated cost data on the cost of clinical trials. And remarkably, some of the sponsors of this legislation proposed going even further than our white paper had proposed, and mandating disclosure not just by the government entities that conduct and fund clinical trials, but also by industry as well. So initially, I think there were a handful of sponsors, including Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota, Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, Carol Maloney, representative here in New York. I know the number of sponsors has now expanded to something like 10 or 15. So hopefully this is something that will continue to build momentum. And I'll just say, I think it's exciting that we may conceivably get transparency, not just from government, but from industry too.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Dudu, can you speak a little bit about the cost items that MRC collects, maybe in comparison? I know it's hard to know what the details were from Chris's talk and from their report, but you know, are these quite similar in fact, in terms of what you're thinking about collecting cost data to those that were outlined by Chris as being the main drivers of clinical trial costs? Or are there any other reflections about these cost items and the feasibility really of implementing this?
Thanks. That's an interesting question, and I think it's what Chris highlighted is really important, because our databases only collect the national budget, so it's one cost and it doesn't break it down. And if we want to break it down, I think we really need to share the actual cost and breaking it down, right? And I see it as something that should be considered, and especially even for the African registry, the data that we're collecting in the African region, because we don't know the cost. And when you look at the cost, you could clearly see that it's kind of like numbers that are thumbs-sucked, if you like, right? And you can't argue. You can't argue because at the end of the day, we don't have the guidelines or the legislation that mandates that you need to share. And the cost itself in the national registry, it's mainly for reporting to the national government, and that's it. And it hasn't been a discussion around how do we move a step further in terms of having the cost in a public domain and having our advocacy group accessing that information and be able to challenge some of the issues when it comes to the IP issues, the issues around access to those vaccines or drugs once the trials are finished. Because I think once we have the transparency in the actual cost, and for me, it's looking at how much was that particular vaccine in the trial versus what we are costing the government to be able to roll out that particular vaccine. I think that for me is a critical one, because then we are able to challenge and understand that the costing probably is it's overpriced, and whether government should be investing in such a drug, or maybe we should be looking at generics and other interventions.
Great, thank you for that. I have a couple of specific questions for Rory, a specific question for Bern, and then that are coming through the chat, and then a couple sort of very general questions, which I'll just pose to the group, and whoever wants to can put their hand up or answer. So first of all, Rory, you mentioned a 2.5-fold increase in revenue. Can you just clarify for whom? And secondly, is there interest to include clinical trial cost transparency in the Good Clinical Trial Initiative that you mentioned? So
in terms of revenue, it's the revenue for the companies. The sales increased by 2.5-fold. But it covered a 7.5-fold decrease in the population covered by those drugs. With respect to the Good Clinical Trial Collaborative proposals, guidelines, the whole idea is that they're developed by the community. So please, anyone out there who wants to propose things that are included in it, do engage in that collaboration to help ensure that they really do drive drive a reversal of the terrible impact of ICH-GCP over the last 25 years. I mean, it's been horrendous to watch.
I think we lost Rory there. I wonder if that's just me or if that's for everyone, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question, and we'll hope that Rory can join us again. For Bern, can you talk a bit about the challenges that MSF has encountered as a kind of, you mentioned non-usual suspects being involved in a clinical trial. For example, was it difficult to budget for the TB practical trial given the lack of available cost information?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, the direct answer is yes. It was very difficult to budget. Of course, our trial, we implemented it in a couple of countries. So the costs of clinical trials tend to be very different depending on the country and in a sense, the clinical trial market to a certain extent in those countries. So it was difficult. Indeed, we looked around to see, are there similar trials that we could use with regards to how they were budgeted, but when you find in most situations, indeed, if any publication of clinical trial costs, they just be a gross big number, and you have no idea which component actually will cost exactly what. And I think Roy highlighted some of the challenges with regards to, let's say, monitoring and decisions to do that. Exactly the same thing, because obviously a lot of CROs provide this, and yeah, you probably could put out a tent or something, but it really is very difficult to know whether you're striking the right balance in terms of how much this will cost. So we have to say, as MSF, we're quite privileged with regards to how we get our funding, and therefore we were able to make adjustments as we go along to ensure that we have adequate resources to complete the trial. But I guess in most institutions that would have wanted to know upfront how much it would cost, this would not be realistic, a realistic endeavor. And maybe just touching, I saw another question. I'll just link it to this in the fact that so the issue about being able to differentiate how much does it cost to do a trial, how much does it cost to treat a patient who is not participating in a trial, is indeed part of the challenge. That's why I think earlier I mentioned that I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but we think this is important, and we need to try it, and we need to really tease that out and do our best to be able to share that itemized trial cost data. Thanks.
Thank you. We have two questions that came through that I think are kind of related. It's sort of like, what are the potential unintended consequences of an increase in transparency about trial costs? So one question, which was directed to Rory, I don't know if we have him back, but can be answered by anyone, is, do you think there's a risk that sharing trial cost data will further reduce research into common conditions? It's one question. And I think it's kind of a related question. Won't some countries making laws that require cost transparency potentially drive the private sector, so pharmaceutical companies and so forth, to move their trials to more lenient states, quote unquote? Who wants to take either one or both of those? And Rory, I see we have you back. Great.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. No, I think it's a really good idea to have a sense of the costs. I'm afraid when you actually see them, as I know quite a lot of costs of cardiovascular trials, you'll be pretty horrified by how much money is being wasted in these clinical trials. So I think knowing the scale of the cost and knowing what it's being used for, and then determining whether that's a good use of the money will be very valuable. And I think it will actually help some of the companies because they are trying to jump through hoops that the regulators have put in place. So being able to say, this is how much it's cost to go through those hoops, 1/3 of the cost of a large cardiovascular trial has been estimated.
Oh dear, we lost Rory again. Maybe I'll ask if Chris is willing to take on that second question that was posed about potentially driving pharmaceutical companies to more lenient countries. Rory, we're having a little bit of trouble with
yeah, I was just going to say what yeah, my internet seems to break off. I was just going to say that 1/3 of the cost is due to clinical trial monitoring, and there's actually good evidence that that is not cost effective.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Sorry for the signal challenges. Chris.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really, really important question. If I understand it correctly, the question is basically, if we mandate disclosure of trial costs, will we discourage industry from running trials in the jurisdictions that have those mandates? I'll say it's an important concern, but I think an addressable one for two reasons. One is that large jurisdictions, South Africa, India, the United States, EU, these are jurisdictions where just the number of patients and the existing infrastructure to conduct clinical trials is so important to the global trial enterprise that I think industry can't realistically pull out altogether. Maybe equally or more important, I will also say the same sort of argument can be sort of marshaled against all kinds of regulation of clinical trials. Think here of results reporting mandates, right, which were very controversial, but went into effect in the United States, 10, 20 years ago, or ethical regulations, about the treatment of patients, the collection of data, et cetera. Anytime I think industry is regulated, they will respond by threatening to stop doing research. But every time I think governments take a stand and impose regulations, we find that industry is able to accommodate.
Good point. Couple of questions for Dudu here, and then I'm going to come back to some kind of broader tactical and methodological type questions. Dudu, the questions for you are twofold. One, are the South African, also the Pan-African registry data open to all, or do you have to be a trial sponsor to be able to access those registries? And also, can you say a little bit more about the national budget and why it isn't accessible or publicly available, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, so so the data in our registry is in the public domain. So anyone can access our websites, because that's what a clinical trial database is, to make trial information be in the public domain, except in the national registry, the national budget, which then links to the second point. I've answered that question on the chart. As I was talking about it earlier on, I think the issue of the budget not being accessible, the simple answer is really about privacy, because even when we get the record, you find that researchers will put a 0. Then we'll have a back and forth. You need to include the budget. Whether it's correct, whether it's not correct, it's unknown, right? So it's a matter of really getting the buy-in from researchers and understanding what is the value of sharing the cost and making it publicly available. Because I think if we haven't done that and have all the legislation that governs sharing the cost of the trial, which can mandate researchers to make the trial cost public, then we'll be winning. Because right now, the other point that always becomes an issue is that even clinical trial registry is seen as just a database. There's no value in sharing even the trial information in the registry, right? So it starts from the cost and even sharing the results at the end of the trial. So we struggle really to get researchers to come back and update information and sharing the cost. So now you could imagine that if we are to make the national budget accessible, to the public, probably we're not going to even see the trials that are happening. People, researchers will not even come to the registry to register their trial if, there hasn't been a legislation or a guidance that governs that this should be in the public domain. And really, the cost is for reporting to the National Department of Health. And at this point, it's a private issue that we send to the National Department of Health, that this is the cost for this trial in the specific disease. But in actual fact, is it the true reflection of the actual cost? That's the question that we need to unpack and really understand, because a national budget is just one line item, which doesn't break it down to the T of what is the actual cost of the trial.
And maybe just to follow up, Juju, on that more concretely, which policies and legislative frameworks in the South African context would need to be changed, in your view, to make this requirement, mandatory? And then Fatima, I saw a hand go up before. I don't know if you wanted to answer a previous question. I'll come to you just after.
I mean, we use the South African good clinical practice guideline, where the South African National Clinical Trial Registry is mentioned there. But it's mentioned at the beginning. It's all about, at the beginning of the trial, you have to register your trial in SANCTA, in the National Registry. But it doesn't give the specifics of exactly what, I mean, when I look at it, even the follow-up and the 6 months report and updating the trial information, it's not there. It's all about, at the beginning, before you start your trial, you need to get your trial number to start recruiting. But further on, it's not there. Perhaps that would be the start for us to look at that SAGCP guideline and include some of these points that relates to transparency and ensuring that researchers conform to that, because ethics and SAPRA are also looking at this guideline when they are reviewing their protocol, so we can hold researchers accountable, both public researchers or even other researchers coming into the country. This is a guideline that governs the research in the country.
Super interesting. I almost want to have a follow-up for a question that I have to link with some of the discussions in the US. But Fatima, can I ask if you have some responses either to where we are now in the conversation or to the previous questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's linked to the questions in the Q&A box about would companies then move to other countries? And I think that maybe what we need to do as a community of researchers and academics and activists is think about this very differently. These are not companies making handbags, right? These are companies that are researching life-saving technology for people who are getting sick and dying. So this idea that the data, that the cost information, issues around trial protocols can be kept private or can be kept secret it's something that we have to really, I think, overturn, because this narrative has emerged in COVID. And in COVID, what we saw was that the risk for clinical trials was socialized. It was heavily subsidized. And up until now, we haven't been having these conversations, and COVID, I think, lifted up that issue. That when you have so much risk being socialized, but access being privatized and being denied to millions of people around the world at the same time, then you have a problem. And that's where I think this double standards of the self-interest of the industry has to come into play. If they want to move their trials elsewhere, then my response is, so be it. Those are not the companies we want in our countries, because we don't say that we won't pass laws around protecting workers or unionization or around sexual orientation or around dignity or around the right to housing just because it's going to offend some company, right? So that's the first thing. We live in a constitutional democracy. We can't pick and choose what kind of standards of transparency we want. But I think for me, the irony in that kind of approach by the industry is that they want the protection of business and the industry, and they have a self-interest in transparency. But this commitment to transparency is only when it suits them. So on the one hand, you want like what they call first world human rights norms and standards for the countries in which they headquartered or do they work, but they don't want those same standards to be applicable to the trials that they're doing in our countries. I mean, there's some trials that are being approved in our country that wouldn't even get approval, I think, in the US, and we can talk about that later. And then just the final point around when we talk about the risk being socialized and the amount of money that's being put in, it's not just for the sake of transparency and we want this information. This data is so critical for determining what's a fair price. And if you don't disclose all of the aspects of R&D, none of us, including industry, can say that the price that they're charging for 20 years or 10 years or even 5 years is a fair price. And that's the issue of competition law and excessive pricing. So we are all in the dark. Our competition authorities, without the R&D data, cannot determine whether the price the company is charging for a cancer medicine or a particular vaccine is actually a fair price. So I think there's also a fair pricing argument. There's issues around business and human rights obligations when you come into a country, particularly the global south. And then obviously there's issues around, the socializing of the risk of these clinical trials.
And that leads perfectly to one of the other questions we received in the chat. Suppose government funding agencies would impose public disclosure of clinical trial costs. The question here is, in your view, to what extent and in what way could government or governments attribute the cost to an invention and set a fair price to facilitate access? I mean, I would maybe add here, and please raise your hand if you want to answer this, or Fatima, I'll come back to you. I mean, I think we've spent a lot of years trying to actually debunk the myth that currently it is R&D costs that are driving how prices, how medicines and other life-saving health technologies are priced. So partly what I would argue here is, yes, it gives us a better understanding, as I said earlier, to have a policy conversation that is not muddled, that is not where we're all blind, as you say. But I think the more the sort of next level question is, well, then what should go into setting a fair and accessible and equitable price? And I think many of us have been arguing it has much more to do with the manufacturing costs, the cost of goods, what is fair, and how can we think about things like a reasonable and sustainable margin, but not completely excessive price gouging. But we can only have that conversation if this first part of the equation around R&D costs is somehow clarified and disclosed. Anybody else want to comment on that? I'm sorry, because I'm not seeing all the boxes, so I'm not sure if your hand is up. I'll do my best. Goodness, we are at 9:20 Eastern time, which means we have about 10 minutes. Let me see if there are any other questions that you see in the chat, speakers, and that you would like to answer. Otherwise, I'm going to go to what I think is kind of a nice question to bring it back to really why we're even talking about this to begin with, not so much the 30,000 foot or meter discussions about innovation and equitable access, but ultimately about communities and people who are affected by these diseases. Can anyone speak a little bit about the experience of involving communities and survivors of TB in the case of TB practical or other diseases where clinical trials are being conducted for some of these advocacy points? This is a question that came in. I think it's a lovely question and maybe a nice way to close the question and answer portion of the discussion. Anyone interested in answering that question about the involvement of communities in these questions around transparency and broader advocacy?
Maybe I can just come in to say, I think we need to accept some of the steps that we need to take ourselves as MSF. I recognize it. So for when we developed the TB practical trial, we have engaged communities and people affected by TB, not only in the design phases, but in terms of implementation of the trial. Depending on trial sites, in some other areas, we could only access the patients in the clinics and facilities, and other trial sites. And I see that Christina from Think is also on this. We in South Africa, because the engagement of communities is much more developed. You would have you can engage with community groups that actually really understand and are able to contribute to this. And I think that is a strong component that needs to be part of it. I would have to also have to own up that part of that engagement did not talk about cost. And I think this is the areas that we need to think about. In our transparency policy for MSF, we talked about sharing results, not only in terms of publication conferences, but with communities, ensuring and I see from this discussion that we do need to extend that also when we're sharing about the trial costs. We need to be having a reasonable conversation with communities, so they should also be able to understand and hold us to account for the contributions that communities make in clinical trials.
Thank you, Vern. And I think that's actually a wonderful place to kind of end the discussion part of this incredibly important conversation. We will, as someone suggested in the chat, try to preserve the chat, as there was a ton of interesting information there, and MSF will make that available as part of the outcome report. If I may, since we're just down to the last few minutes, could I ask each participant to sum up in your own words, maybe just a few sentences, why clinical trial cost transparency is critical for the ultimate goal of equitable access to health tools and technologies. And I'm going to go the other way around. So I'll start with Fatima.
Oh, I need a second to think about that.
That's
I think
fine.
start with Chris, who
Yeah,
also
sure.
has his hand up.
Okay, fine. We'll go that way. No problem. Chris,
thrown under the
go
bus,
ahead.
so to speak, but I'm happy to go. Thank you. And thank you so much for this terrific event. And I've learned so much from the other panelists and from the Q&A. So just incredibly grateful. Very quickly, I see some questions in chat about both, is this a new issue or is this an old issue? And should we be asking for cost transparency, not just about drugs, but maybe about devices too? I think the answers to those quickly are, this is not a new issue. This is a long-running battle, and this is just a piece of a longer-running war for transparency and accountability in the sort of innovation and distribution ecosystem. Part of the reason I am so excited about this work and so proud to have a small part in it is that I see this as a necessary step toward a more radical reimagining of the way that we create and disseminate drugs. And I think a lot about, in the US and elsewhere, the role that the public sector can play, and the public sector taking on a bigger role, not just funding early stage research or acting as a kind of piggy bank for industry, but actually taking ownership of more of the technologies that we fund, doing distribution, doing manufacturing, and so on. Getting to the bottom of how much it costs to run a trial is a part of getting to the bottom of how much it costs to do all of this work. But I think with that information, we can imagine more radical transformation, and that's why I'm so excited about it.
Wonderful. Rory, do we have you? And could I ask you to say just a couple of words in closing?
I think that getting the disaggregated costs will be really helpful, because we'll get a much clearer idea of the waste and therefore ways in which to reduce costs of trials. Because it's the roads not trod that I worry about. It's the innovative treatments that never get developed, because the clinical trial costs of developing them are not considered worthwhile. And in cardiovascular disease, that's increasingly becoming a problem. So we have a lot of really interesting biotech companies coming up with novel therapies that really could transform people's lives. But the cost of doing the large-scale clinical trials in cardiovascular disease and other chronic conditions are so high. I mean, $2 billion for a single trial of the PCSK9 antibody is ridiculous. And that means that there are lots of innovative treatments that will never get to market unless we work out how to get rid of this waste.
Thank you. Absolutely. Bern, a few closing remarks from you.
Yeah, I think I would just reflect what has been highlighted throughout this this webinar. I do see that shining a light on clinical trial costs is one of the strongest, I think, steps that can be taken to allow, because cost issues are very difficult, and the imbalance between those who are powerful to make such decisions and others is so much that if you shine the light, then we can have a much wider, a much bigger kind of a push and a really public conversation around this. So it really is not easy, but it is critical. It is an important step to take.
Indeed. Dudu, you're sitting in a very important place in a very important country for the future of who will be driving biomedical innovation for communities in need in the future. Some final thoughts from you?
Sorry, I lost you there a bit.
Go ahead, we have you back.
Okay, I lost the question.
Just closing one or two sentences, your thoughts about the importance of this topic for the future there in South Africa and more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, to close here is that I think we need to do a whole lot of advocacy around transparency on a broader scale, which includes cost and using the registry as a tool of accessing that information. I think that would be my highlight, if we can all access that information in the registry. Thanks.
And to take us across the finish line, Fatima, please, your final thoughts.
So I like Chris's call for radical reimagination of transparency in the way we manage clinical trials. And with that in mind, I think that we have to ask every single clinical trial lead in our own countries from now on to commit to advocating for greater transparency around the costs of the trial. So I think it's not good enough in 2022 for clinical trial leads to say either they're going to be the henchmen for the industry and hide that information or not fully disclose it, or that they worry that if they disclose that, then they may not get future trials to manage. I think that's just simply not a good enough reason any longer. And they have to be the frontline advocates for that radical call for transparency, because they are the ones that are running those trials. And then the second thing is, I think African governments have to invest more in actual clinical trials, especially in neglected diseases. We can't just keep on relying on the industry. But if we are going to put money in clinical trials, and we are going to use public knowledge and public scientists and public institutions and the public, the community that, the black bodies that are used to test all of these different medical technologies in our continent, then there has to be conditions attached for equitable and timely post-trial benefit sharing. So if we can't have fair prices, then we shouldn't be doing those trials. It's a thing that we asked around Tabla. What is the point of doing the trial in South Africa for an HIV injection that most people in our country can't even benefit? So then it means that the trial was done for academic kudos and to benefit other people elsewhere, not to benefit, people in our own country. Thanks.
And that is exactly the place to end this conversation just for now. Obviously, this is ongoing, as people have mentioned. This is a discussion that is, in some cases, has been ongoing for years or decades, but how we ultimately grapple with these questions, how policymakers, how researchers and scientists, how communities grapple with these questions to build towards a more effective and equitable biomedical innovation system that results in equitable access to health tools. Because why are we doing research but to help identify tools, whether those are devices, diagnostics, tests, or treatments or vaccines that could ultimately reduce suffering and save lives. That's why the research enterprise is important to begin with. So a huge thank you to this incredible panel of speakers that has joined us over the last hour and a half. A very big thank you to MSF for organizing and convening this webinar. As I mentioned, the recording and an outcome report along with the chat will be made available publicly. And with that, I would like to close and thank everyone for your participation today. Thank you.
Thank you.